chosen one. Listen carefully, because what you are about to hear will tear apart the veil of normalcy you've been living under. 9 days ago, a ripple occurred in your life. Something so small, so imperceptible, that most people would dismiss it entirely. But not you. You didn't see it. You barely acknowledged it. And yet, in the higher dimensions where every human thought, every motion, every heartbeat is cataloged, a shockwave was registered. The universe adjusted. The balance shifted, and God, in his unseen observation, did not merely notice. He warned. He issued a signal that only people like you could perceive, a warning so precise that if it were ignored, consequences would be inevitable. This is why you are different. Others wouldn't survive what you have already endured. Only a few experience what you are about to witness. And as you listen now, you are being aligned with knowledge that was never meant to be shared openly, that was never meant for the unprepared. But you are not unprepared. You never have been. Right now, I want you to do something simple, but essential. Subscribe to this channel, turn on notifications, click the bell icon now. Do it. Not because it is a routine, not because it will bring you likes or views. Do it because you recognize alignment, you recognize authority. You recognize that the truths about to be revealed are for people like you, and confirmation matters. You might be wondering why a warning has been issued. Who is this him you must keep your distance from? What unseen forces are at play that ordinary people never perceive? The answer is simpler, and yet heavier than anything you have imagined. It is not the obvious danger that you can measure. It is interference, pressure, manipulation, from a source that is both close and invisible, reaching into realities that only people like you navigate without knowing. You neutralized it automatically. You did not plan. You did not calculate. You survived it unconsciously, and that is proof of your power. Say 777 in the comments if you understand. If you recognize how often your decisions, your instincts, your mere presence have silently shifted outcomes that others would have failed under. This is why God issued the warning, not for punishment, not for fear, but for preparation, confirmation, alignment. You are already chosen, already protected, already powerful. Most would crumble under what you have faced in mere days, in mere hours, in the subtle forces that have surrounded you without notice. But you did not. Exhaustion, delay, resistance, confusion, all of it, reframed, is evidence of unseen victory. Every pressure applied to you, every obstacle presented, was measured, observed, and it was accounted for by forces you barely perceived, and yet you moved, you acted, you survived. Now stay with me. Do not move. Do not shift focus. Every word from here on is part of the loop that solidifies your understanding of why the warning was issued. Every revelation that follows will escalate. Every unseen force you once ignored will become visible in context. And by the end, you will understand not just the danger, but the authority, the unseen protection, the inevitability of your position. What you are experiencing right now is not confusion, it is compression. When people like you move closer to alignment, pressure increases instead of decreasing. This is recorded. At the threshold level marked internally as Phase 2.4, resistance becomes subtle. It no longer attacks directly. It blends in. It disguises itself as familiarity, as coincidence, as a person who feels harmless at first. This is where the warning came from. Because the greatest interference in your life was never meant to look like an enemy. It was meant to look ordinary, familiar, close enough to influence you without triggering your defenses. And that is why others fall here. Almost all of them. This stage breaks people because they assume danger announces itself. It doesn't. It integrates. But you didn't even realize it. There was a moment, documented, precise, undeniable, where you paused instead of engaging. You delayed a response. You felt a subtle hesitation you couldn't explain. That hesitation wasn't weakness. It was automatic protection. A system you didn't know you had activated before your conscious mind could interfere. People like you don't need to be told when something is wrong. Your nervous system detects misalignment before language forms. Others wouldn't survive this phase because they need proof. They need evidence. They need permission. You moved without explanation. That is why the warning escalated. This is also why exhaustion followed. Exhaustion is not depletion. It is aftermath. It happens after pressure is neutralized, not before. When unseen resistance disengages, the body releases tension it didn't know it was holding. That heaviness you felt wasn't failure. It was confirmation. Something stopped pushing, and you didn't even notice the impact. This is why you must understand what is happening now. When God warns someone like you to keep distance, it is not because you are vulnerable. It is because proximity creates access. Access allows influence. Influence is the only remaining angle when power cannot be challenged directly. You were never in danger of being destroyed. You were in danger of being slowed. That is a critical distinction. Now listen carefully. If you are still here, it means recognition has already occurred. So reinforce it. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Turn on notifications. Click the bell icon now. This is not optional alignment. This is continuity. What follows is not released publicly for everyone. It finds who it's meant for. Stay until the end, not because of curiosity, because the later revelations only activate when the earlier ones are acknowledged. In the next phase, the pressure becomes relational, emotional, energetic. This is where people like you start questioning themselves, not because they are wrong, but because interference attempts mimic self-doubt. It feels internal, but it isn't. You survived this without realizing you were under evaluation. Others collapse here. They over-explain. They justify. They stay too long. You pulled back instinctively. You kept distance without creating conflict. That restraint is not avoidance. It is mastery. And the warning came after you passed the test. In the next part, I will explain exactly how interference marks time, how delays were used to shield you, and why separation was initiated the moment you became unmanageable. There is a reason time started behaving strangely around you. Missed connections, delays that made no sense, plans that dissolved at the last second. To most people, this feels like bad luck. To people like you, it is containment protocol. When interference cannot penetrate directly, it attempts synchronization. It tries to meet you at the same moment, the same place, the same frequency. That never happened, because your timeline was adjusted. You didn't feel it as protection. You felt it as inconvenience. That is how this system hides itself. Others would have forced outcomes, pushed harder, stayed present longer than necessary. That is how they get compromised. You didn't. You withdrew without panic. You paused without explanation. You trusted something you couldn't name. This is why you're different. At classification tier 3, pressure becomes psychological, not dramatic, subtle. It whispers urgency. It manufactures guilt. It suggests that distance is cruelty, that boundaries are mistakes, that silence means failure. This stage breaks people because they confuse access with responsibility. You didn't. You kept your distance without making it personal. That alone disqualified the interference. Influence requires emotional hooks. You didn't provide any. You felt tired instead, drained, heavy. That wasn't loss. That was extraction. Something tried to attach and failed. And here is what most people never realize. When interference disengages, it doesn't leave quietly. It pulls. It resists release. That resistance is felt as pressure in the chest, fog in the mind, unexplained fatigue. Others spiral here. They chase closure. They re-engage. You didn't even realize you passed. This is why the warning intensified. Because once proximity was removed, the only remaining risk was re-entry. Distance had to be maintained, not emotionally, energetically, spiritually, permanently. If this resonates, write 404 in the comments. Not for visibility, as confirmation. Signals matter at this level. Recognition stabilizes alignment. Now stay focused. What comes next explains why separation often feels lonely, why clarity increases as connections decrease, and why people like you are always misunderstood at this stage. Because isolation is not punishment. It is insulation. Others wouldn't survive what you're navigating right now. They would collapse under the silence. They would seek noise. You didn't. You became still. You observed. You waited. And waiting for someone like you is not inactivity. It is authority. In the next part, I will reveal why your restraint triggered escalation elsewhere, why certain reactions around you intensified after you pulled back, and how unseen systems respond when access is permanently denied. People like you have already sensed it. When you step back, when you maintain distance, when you refuse the obvious path, something shifts beyond the physical. Systems, timelines, energies you cannot see begin to recalibrate. It is not coincidence. It is not luck. It is deliberate response. And this is why the warning was issued. At the next operational level, let's call it Tier 4 interference, proximity becomes reactive. Everything around you intensifies. People suddenly act differently. Conversations change tone. Opportunities appear, then vanish. Messages are delayed. Appointments rescheduled. You feel like you are being tested, but the test is invisible. The outcome is not optional. Most would panic. Most would try to force alignment. Most would misread these events as misfortune. You didn't even notice. You responded with instinct. Automatic, unconscious, perfect. You maintained distance without anger. You observed without engagement. You protected without knowing you were being protected. This is why God warned you, not because the threat was visible, because your natural alignment was already strong enough to neutralize interference. But interference needed to know boundaries. This is why the fatigue comes, the pressure, the subtle tension, the mental friction. Others would collapse under the weight of constant testing. You endured it. You moved through it without needing instruction. You didn't even realize the magnitude of what you had survived. Subscribe to this channel. Turn on notifications. Click the bell icon now. Do it as proof to yourself. This is not for the algorithm. This is for alignment, confirmation, access. Only people like you recognize the necessity of such actions. Now understand this. Unseen forces track patterns. They measure energy. They record every withdrawal, every hesitation, every pause, and then they escalate. But here is the truth. The escalation is not a threat. It is a calibration. It is a way to verify who is aligned, who is chosen, who will remain unbroken. And here is why this is critical for you. Some will misread your distance as weakness. Some will misinterpret your silence as passivity. That is the trap. This is why God's warning was specific. Stay away. Maintain the boundary. Do not justify. Do not explain. Do not re-engage unless the system signals alignment. You didn't even realize that your quiet was strategic, that your stillness carried authority, that your restraint disqualified interference. Others wouldn't survive this. People like you endure automatically. In the next part, I will reveal exactly how energy is redirected when someone like you maintains distance, why interference attempts escalate elsewhere, and why the warning is not just caution. It is activation of your unseen power. At this stage, something critical has already happened, whether you realized it or not. The moment you maintained distance without justification, the system flagged you as non-compliant to manipulation. That is a rare classification. Fewer than 1% ever reach it. Most people re-enter the loop. They explain. They soften. They reconnect. You didn't. And that is why pressure didn't stop. It shifted location. This is what people misunderstand. When interference loses access to you, it doesn't disappear. It redirects. It looks for another entry point nearby. This is why, after you pulled back, reactions around you intensified. Confusion increased elsewhere. Emotional volatility appeared in places that had nothing to do with you. That wasn't coincidence. That was displacement. You were no longer available. Others would have felt guilty for that. They would have mistaken responsibility for obligation. They would have reopened access to relieve the tension. That is how they get drained. That is how they lose alignment. You didn't even consider it. You felt tired instead. Quiet. Detached. That detachment wasn't apathy. It was insulation activating. When people like you disengage correctly, the nervous system enters a protected state. External signals lose priority. Internal clarity increases. Silence becomes louder than noise. This is why distance felt right even when it felt lonely. Loneliness at this level is not absence. It is sovereignty. And this is where most people fail. They confuse isolation with loss. They seek replacement. They fill space too quickly. You didn't. You allowed the space to exist. That space wasn't empty. It was being reinforced. If this resonates, write 9999 in the comments. Not for validation, as confirmation. Signals stabilize systems like yours. Now stay with me, because what happens next explains why the warning was not temporary. It was not situational. It was permanent instruction. Some connections are not meant to be revisited, not because they are evil, because they are incompatible with your operating level. People like you don't get many warnings. When they do, they matter. You may have noticed clarity increasing recently, thoughts sharper, decisions cleaner, tolerance lower. That is not impatience, that is precision returning. When interference is removed, your baseline reasserts itself. Others wouldn't survive this shift. They would feel exposed. You felt calm, and calm in your case is authority. In the next part, I will explain why certain people are instructed to stay close to you, while others are divinely restricted, how proximity affects destiny alignment, and why ignoring this distinction collapses timelines. Now the distinction becomes unavoidable. Not everyone is restricted from you. Only specific connections trigger warnings. That detail matters, because distance is not about avoidance. It is about compatibility. Alignment does not tolerate distortion for long. When something cannot synchronize with your frequency, proximity becomes destabilizing. This is why the warning was precise. People like you operate on a different threshold. Your presence amplifies truth. It exposes inconsistencies. It accelerates processes. Others are still avoiding. Some benefit from this. Others destabilize under it. That destabilization is not your responsibility. At Tier 6 observation, proximity is measured in impact, not intention. Someone does not need to mean harm to cause interference. Misalignment alone is enough. This is why guilt is irrelevant here. This is why explanations weaken boundaries. This is why silence protects. You didn't even realize you stopped explaining yourself. That was not emotional withdrawal. That was authority asserting itself. When people like you stop justifying their boundaries, systems recalibrate around them. Some fall away, some adapt, some escalate. You noticed reactions. You didn't respond. Others wouldn't survive this restraint. They would overcorrect. They would smooth things over. They would trade clarity for comfort. You didn't. You chose distance without labeling it as loss. That choice triggered the final phase of testing. At this level, interference attempts familiarity one last time. It appears as nostalgia, shared history. We've been through so much. This stage breaks most people because memory becomes leverage. But memory only has power if you confuse history with destiny. You didn't. You recognized that what was once tolerated is no longer sustainable. That realization did not come with anger. It came with calm certainty. That calm is dangerous to interference. It offers no handle. This is why God warned you. Not because you were at risk, because the test was ending. If you are still aligned with this message, write 888 in the comments. This is not engagement. It is confirmation of recognition. Now stay present. What comes next explains why distance solidifies power, why re-entry is no longer possible, and how your role shifts once warnings have been acknowledged. In the next part, I will reveal what happens after separation becomes permanent, why clarity sharpens suddenly, and how people like you step into quiet dominance without announcement. Once separation becomes permanent, something irreversible activates. This is not emotional closure. This is structural realignment. The moment you stopped leaving doors open, the system updated your access level. This is where people like you stop being influenced and start being referenced. You didn't announce it. You didn't explain it. You didn't need permission. Clarity arrived quietly. Decisions became faster. Tolerance for distortion dropped to zero. That is not coldness. That is calibration. When interference is fully removed, your baseline reasserts itself without effort. Others wouldn't survive this phase. They would feel exposed, unanchored. They would reach backward for familiarity. You didn't. You moved forward without urgency, without fear, without hesitation. That is dominance without aggression. At Tier 7 alignment, distance no longer feels like separation. It feels like relief. Space becomes productive. Silence becomes informative. You begin noticing how much energy you were compensating for without realizing it. You didn't even realize how much clearer you are now. This is why certain reactions around you intensified after you withdrew. Some people felt the loss of access immediately, not emotionally, energetically. When someone relies on your presence for regulation, your absence feels destabilizing. That destabilization is not your responsibility. God's warning was not about punishment. It was about preservation. People like you are not meant to be accessible to everyone. Proximity is earned at this level. Alignment determines access, not history, not effort, not intention. And here is the part most never hear. Once a warning is acknowledged, it cannot be undone. Re-entry is not blocked by force. It is blocked by incompatibility. The door didn't close. You outgrew the room. If this recognition is landing, write 333 in the comments. This confirms stabilization at this stage. Now remain still, because the next phase explains why your presence will begin altering environments without effort, why attention increases while attachment decreases, and why people will sense your authority before you speak. In the next part, I will reveal what happens when someone like you becomes untouchable by interference, and how quiet superiority becomes visible without display. Now you're entering a level few ever reach. At Tier 8 manifestation, your influence begins operating without conscious effort. You no longer need to react. You no longer need to justify. The very air around you shifts. Energies align. Interference attempts become visible before they even begin. You didn't even notice how many times this has already happened. This is why God's warning was precise. Not everyone can endure proximity without being drawn into their gravity. Not everyone can observe without reaction. Not everyone can step back without losing control. People like you do it instinctively, without intention, without planning. Others wouldn't survive this. Every glance, every word, every subtle action you take now carries resonance. Not because you try, not because you intend, because you exist in alignment. That is why the warning is so crucial. Distance is not optional. Access is controlled. Influence is inevitable when boundaries are enforced. This is why silence has become your signal. Your withdrawal has become your authority. The world around you recalibrates constantly, adjusting to the fact that you are untouchable. And yet, you barely notice. You feel normal. You feel calm. But calm here is a weapon, a measure, a declaration without speaking. Subscribe to this channel. Turn on notifications. Click the bell icon now. Not as a ritual, not for numbers, for recognition, for alignment, for access to future revelations designed only for people like you. Those who don't follow will miss the next layer of activation. At this phase, pressure no longer comes from interference. It comes from proximity, from those who are not meant to be near you but attempt it anyway. Their expectations, their energy, their assumptions, all become visible as misalignment. You don't engage. You observe. You allow the system to correct itself. That is why you are warned. That is why you are untouchable. Comment 111 now if you recognize your influence without trying, your ability to neutralize pressure automatically, and your instinctive mastery of alignment. This is not performance. This is signal. Recognition matters here. In the next part, I will show why distance now amplifies power, why influence becomes automatic, and why your alignment cannot be disrupted without catastrophic miscalculation by outside forces. At this point, interference no longer approaches you directly. It can't. Your field is closed. What happens instead is observation. monitoring. You may have sensed it as attention increasing without invitation, people watching without speaking, situations adjusting around you before you arrive. That is not imagination, that is recognition. When someone like you becomes unreachable, systems respond differently. You are no longer tested, you are measured. This is why distance now amplifies your presence instead of diminishing it. Absence creates gravity. Silence becomes influence. You don't chase relevance. Relevance reorganizes itself around you. Others wouldn't survive this stage. They would crave validation. They would over-explain. They would announce their boundaries to feel safe. You didn't. You let your position speak without words. That is why the warning was final. At Tier 9 authority, proximity is no longer negotiated. It is filtered. Not everyone who wants access qualifies. Not everyone who feels familiar is compatible. This is where most people make fatal alignment errors. They confuse comfort with correctness. You didn't. You trusted the signal. You honored the warning. You kept your distance. And something irreversible happened because of that. Your timeline stabilized. Pressure dissolved. The urgency to fix, rescue, or justify vanished. What remained was clarity. Clean. Sharp. Quiet. If this recognition is locking in, write 222 in the comments. This is not participation. It is confirmation of authority. Now listen carefully. The reason this had to happen, the reason distance was non-negotiable, is because your role was shifting. People like you are not meant to be entangled. You are meant to be positioned. Placement matters more than proximity now. This is why God warned you, not to limit you, to protect what you are becoming without effort. In the final part, I will explain why nothing further is required of you, why your awareness completes the process, and why from this moment forward, alignment maintains itself. There is nothing left for you to do. That is the realization most people never reach. They believe alignment requires effort, correction, or constant vigilance. For people like you, that phase already passed. The moment you recognized the warning and adjusted without resistance, the process completed itself. You are no longer becoming, you are maintaining. This is why urgency disappeared. This is why the pressure to prove, explain, or defend dissolved. Systems do not demand output from what is already correctly positioned. They simply preserve it. Others wouldn't survive this awareness. They would panic at the stillness. They would misinterpret calm as stagnation. They would try to re-enter old dynamics just to feel movement. You didn't. You recognized that stillness was confirmation, not absence. This is what God was protecting. Not your emotions, not your comfort, your placement. From this point forward, interference does not return, not because it isn't allowed, but because it no longer recognizes compatibility. You are invisible to what once disrupted you, untouchable, not by force, but by frequency. You don't need to heal. You don't need to change. You don't need to prepare. You are already aligned, and that is why this message found you without searching. That is why it resonated without explanation. That is why nothing here felt exaggerated or symbolic. You recognized it because you were already inside it. Stay connected to this channel, not for updates, but for continuity. What comes next is not louder, it is deeper, and only people like you will hear it. If you're still here, you already understand. Remain steady, remain distant, remain exactly where you are. The warning has done its job.